Good morning. This is Environmental Intelligence, episode 19. It's April 1st, 2026. Here's what changed overnight in the environmental regulatory landscape. British Columbia has introduced a formal issues resolution protocol tool inside its environmental assessment framework. The move is aimed squarely at improving transparency and delivering greater process predictability for everyone involved in complex multi-stakeholder reviews. This is the only qualifying Canadian regulatory development in today's cycle. For busy practitioners balancing multiple files across Western Canada, the practical takeaway is straightforward. Review the protocol's potential application to any active or upcoming environmental assessment projects in British Columbia, while simultaneously keeping a weather eye on cross-border United States policy shifts that could indirectly shape Canadian climate liability and contaminated sites practice in the months ahead. The Government of British Columbia has formally amended its environmental assessment procedures to embed this issues resolution protocol. The change is explicitly designed to create a structured, time-bound process for resolving disputes between project proponents, regulators, and affected stakeholders before disagreements escalate into protracted hearings or judicial review. It also seeks to increase transparency by documenting how technical issues are raised, considered, and resolved while delivering greater process predictability, something that has been a persistent source of frustration and cost overrun on major projects. For environmental consultants and project proponents currently managing environmental assessment applications under the British Columbia Environmental Assessment Act, this protocol provides a defined mechanism to surface and address contested technical or regulatory issues at an earlier stage, rather than allowing them to fester until late-stage adjudication or political intervention. The protocol is particularly relevant where disagreements center on contaminated sites, remediation standards, fisheries values, cumulative effects assessments, or the adequacy of mitigation plans. Current projects sitting in screening, scoping, or formal review stages should now evaluate whether to invoke the protocol for any outstanding matters involving contaminated sites, fisheries values, or cumulative effects. Implementation details were released on March 31st, and early adopters who use the tool thoughtfully are likely to reduce overall timeline risk on complex high-stakes files. What I find particularly interesting here is that this protocol directly confronts one of the most consistent pain points reported by both proponents and regulators in British Columbia environmental assessments: the absence of a clear, defined off-ramp for resolving technical disagreements. In my experience advising on these files, unresolved technical disputes tend to erode trust, inflate legal budgets, and extend project schedules by many months. By creating a formal pathway that forces disciplined dialogue at the right moment, British Columbia is signaling a maturing regulatory system that values efficiency without sacrificing rigor. Consultants who master the protocol's language and timing will gain a meaningful competitive advantage on their BC files. British Columbia MBA has added this issues resolution protocol to the environmental assessment process, providing a defined pathway for resolving technical and process disagreements that have historically slowed progress. The protocol directly affects how contaminated sites' data, risk assessments, and mitigation plans are debated, challenged, and ultimately finalized within the environmental assessment context. Consultants who lead British Columbia environmental assessment applications should treat familiarization with the protocol language as a priority task this week and should actively consider invoking it on active files where technical impasses are already visible, rather than waiting for the issues to compound and delay the overall schedule. While the British Columbia development is the only domestic regulatory change this cycle, several U.S. developments continue to create important indirect signals for Canadian practitioners. Vermont is actively defending its landmark Climate Superfund legislation, which requires major fossil fuel companies to contribute to the costs of climate damages already incurred by the state. Although this litigation sits outside Canada, the ultimate outcome could influence future provincial discussions on climate liability and cost recovery mechanisms, particularly those operating under provincial contaminated sites and climate adaptation frameworks. Canadian practitioners who track potential harmonization or policy precedent should therefore monitor the Vermont case closely. In my view, successful defense of the Vermont approach would likely embolden certain provinces to explore similar financial tools when updating contaminated sites' liability regimes or drafting new climate resilience legislation. Even if the statute is narrowed, the public debate itself is shifting the Overton window on corporate climate accountability in ways that will eventually reach Canadian boardrooms and project financing discussions. Extreme weather events, particularly wildfires and storms, were the primary driver of insured losses across North America in 2025. The data carries direct relevance for Canadian climate adaptation work, including updated flood risk mapping, wildfire interface planning, and the revision of contaminated sites risk assessments in interface or flood-prone areas. Under provincial frameworks such as the British Columbia Contaminated Sites Regulation and Alberta's Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, these loss patterns should now be folded into client adaptation reports and insurance due diligence files. From a practitioner's perspective, 2025's loss data reinforces the need to move beyond static risk assessments toward dynamic, climate-forward conceptual site models. Sites that once appeared stable may now face materially different contaminant mobilization pathways under more frequent extreme precipitation or post-wildfire erosion. Updating exposure pathways and receptor lists is no longer optional on files located in the wildland-urban interface or within mapped floodplains. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has announced the highest ever volume of crop-based biofuels required in the national gasoline supply. This policy shift may increase competitive pressure on Canadian biofuel feedstock markets and could indirectly affect land use planning and carbon accounting considerations in Western Canadian provinces where agricultural land or forestry tenures frequently overlap with contaminated sites remediation projects. For those of us working at the intersection of remediation and land use, the biofuels mandate is a reminder that energy policy and contaminated sites work are more intertwined than they first appear. Higher demand for canola, corn, or forestry residues can change the economic viability of certain remediation approaches or trigger new zoning pressures on brownfield redevelopment. Practitioners should brief clients with cross-border energy or agricultural interests on these potential ripple effects and consider whether updated U.S. blending targets warrant a refresh of long-term land use assumptions in current remediation plans. Texas recently experienced a rapid and somewhat surprising shift in political support for clean energy investments, previously valued at approximately $50 billion. The case study offers practical lessons for Canadian practitioners who advise clients on regulatory risk, political due diligence, and project financing in jurisdictions where energy and environmental policy remain fluid. The speed with which capital allocation and political backing can reverse should serve as a cautionary reminder when structuring long-term remediation liabilities or negotiating multi-year environmental assessment schedules. Shifting from regulatory developments to field practice, let's talk about something every contaminated site's professional encounters: heterogeneous subsurface conditions that continually frustrate our conceptual site models. Imagine you arrive at a former industrial site on the prairies. The Phase 2 environmental site assessment reveals benzene concentrations exceeding Alberta EPEA Tier 1 guidelines in one monitoring well, yet the adjacent well, only 8 meters away, shows no exceedance despite clear evidence of a historical release. This pattern is classic in glacial till and outwash deposits, where preferential pathways and low permeability lenses trap, deflect, or accelerate dissolved phase plumes in ways that uniform conceptual site models simply cannot predict. Both British Columbia's Contaminated Sites Regulation Protocol 4 and CCME guidance are clear that practitioners must characterize this heterogeneity through targeted sampling density and high-quality stratigraphic logging, yet many regulatory submissions continue to rely on evenly spaced monitoring grids that miss the dominant transport features entirely. Experienced practitioners instead prioritize high-resolution soil logging, grain size analysis, and hydraulic conductivity testing at the facies scale before they finalize plume boundaries or select remedies. They also insist on multiple lines of evidence: soil vapor data, groundwater geochemistry, and contaminant age dating, rather than depending on a single monitoring event. The most common mistake I still see in the field is the assumption that one or two representative samples adequately define the source zone or the extent of the plume. That assumption routinely leads to under-designed remediation systems, failed risk assessments, and subsequent regulatory reopeners. The practical fix is straightforward and should be treated as non-negotiable. Build the conceptual site model from detailed stratigraphic interpretation first, then locate sampling points specifically to test the dominant transport pathways, and finally document the heterogeneity explicitly in the regulatory submission so that decision makers understand the uncertainty boundaries. If you are currently working on environmental assessments in British Columbia, I recommend you review the new issues resolution protocol in detail this week and assess its potential application to any active or pending files. Update your project risk registers for all British Columbia environmental assessment files to incorporate the new dispute resolution tool and the associated timelines it introduces. Brief clients who hold cross-border energy or agricultural interests on the potential indirect effects flowing from the updated U.S. biofuels blending targets. Incorporate the 2025 wildfire and storm loss data into climate adaptation and insurance reviews for contaminated sites located in interface or flood-prone areas. Continue to monitor the Vermont Climate Superfund litigation for any precedent that could influence future Canadian provincial cost recovery discussions. In April 2026, stay alert to further British Columbia environmental assessment procedural amendments and any associated guidance documents. Keep reviewing the U.S. EPA biofuels volume obligations and their potential Canadian market or land use implications. Track the Vermont Climate Superfund court proceedings for early signals on corporate climate liability. Based on currently available reporting, no major federal CEPA, CCME, or provincial contaminated sites regulation consultation deadlines appear in the immediate 30-day window before we wow. Tomorrow we'll have more on developing United States policy positions that continue to ripple northward. That's environmental intelligence for today. If this briefing is useful to your practice, please share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content, and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.